During the 2012 season, long before Antonio Brown's final blowout in Pittsburgh, something was already unraveling inside the Steelers' locker room. Public fights between veterans, fractured relationships, and deep philosophical divides about what leadership meant. Even icons like Troy Polamalu couldn't hold it together. Brown's confrontation with Hall of Fame coach Dick LeBeau wasn't an isolated flare-up. It was a seismic signal that the foundation was cracking. If you're into the real story and all the messy twists they don't show on highlight reels, go ahead and subscribe. And if you're sticking around to see how this Browns QB chaos plays out, you should definitely be subscribed. What made the Steelers dominant for years, order, trust, shared sacrifice, was being replaced by fractured egos and conflicting ideologies. Ryan Clark saw it in real time, and by the time the world caught up, it was already too late. The viral clash between Brown and Clark isn't surprising. It's the inevitable result of years of cultural erosion left unchecked. This isn't about one team or one feud. It's about how institutions built on legacy and structure struggle to survive when their stars no longer believe in the rules that built them. And in the vacuum left behind, personal conflicts explode, revealing not just broken relationships, but broken systems. When the footage dropped, NFL fans, media outlets, and executives alike stopped what they were doing, because this wasn't just another sideline scuffle, and it definitely wasn't two ex-teammates having a tense exchange. This was Antonio Brown and Ryan Clark, two men who once wore the same jersey, erupting in public years after their last snap together. What started on the Steelers' practice field in the early 2010s has now detonated in full view of the world. The video wasn't long, but it didn't need to be. Their body language said everything. Clark, firm and unflinching. Brown, animated and visibly agitated. The confrontation was intense and symbolic, not just a continuation of personal resentment, but a collision between philosophies, values, and unresolved institutional failures that have haunted the NFL for over a decade. To understand what's happening, you have to go back. This isn't a grudge born overnight. It started in 2012 when the Steelers broke their own rules to give a third-year receiver, Antonio Brown, a 5-year, $42 million extension. That deal shattered long-standing traditions inside the organization. Players were expected to wait their turn, to rise through the hierarchy. Brown skipped the line. And for veterans like Ryan Clark, who'd built their careers inside a system that valued seniority, discipline, and collective sacrifice, it was a signal that the foundation was shifting beneath them. Brown's response to that shift was simple: perform. And he did. Statistically, he went on to become the greatest wide receiver in Steelers history. 6 consecutive seasons of 100-plus receptions, over 1,200 yards, and 8 touchdowns. But his individual brilliance didn't come with the postseason glory the Steelers were after. No rings, no late January magic, just mounting frustration, both internally and externally. As the locker room deteriorated, veterans fighting, leadership breaking down. Even Troy Polamalu reportedly caught in the fray. Brown's presence grew larger, not just as a player, but as a symbol of everything that had changed. He wasn't afraid to speak up, push back, or defy authority. His confrontation with Hall of Fame defensive coordinator Dick LeBeau was a defining moment. LeBeau was respected across generations. For Brown to challenge him directly was, for many, the ultimate sign of disrespect. But for Brown, it was about standing firm in his identity and rejecting a structure that didn't serve him. Clark, a product of that structure, saw the challenge differently. He saw it as erosion. And when the team's performance couldn't match Brown's output, the divide became impossible to ignore. Clark watched the organization bend to accommodate a star, while the team's ethos, the very culture that built the franchise, was quietly discarded. Fast forward to 2018. Brown reportedly gets into a physical altercation with quarterback Ben Roethlisberger and is benched. That's when Clark, now an ESPN analyst, finally says what he'd been holding in for years. On Get Up, he publicly calls for the Steelers to release Brown and labels him a bad person. Not immature, not out of line, a bad person. And that's where everything exploded. Clark wasn't just another analyst. He was a former teammate, someone who had shared locker rooms, practices, bus rides, playoff heartbreaks. Brown didn't hear an objective take. he heard betrayal. And in January 2019, he made that known by calling Clark an Uncle Tom on Instagram. That accusation took everything to another level. It reframed the entire conflict. No longer was it about football behavior. It was now about race, loyalty, and identity. Brown accused Clark of pandering to white institutions, of using his analyst platform to publicly shame another black man. In Brown's eyes, Clark crossed a line and then kept going. For Clark, the accusation was both personal and professional. He was suddenly defending not just his take on a player, but his entire existence as a black man in a white-dominated media environment. The nuance of the conversation was gone. What was left was raw emotion and a nation of fans dissecting the meaning of solidarity and betrayal. And the league? Silent, just as it had been when Brown's rise disrupted the team's hierarchy, just as it had been when the locker room imploded. The NFL had no structure in place to handle this. No mediation channels. No conflict resolution systems. Just a growing PR nightmare. Brown wanted his grievances to remain private. He believed a teammate should have picked up the phone, not a microphone. Clark believed public conduct with public consequences required public commentary. Both had valid points. But without any institutional effort to bridge that gap, resolution was never an option. And now, years later, we're watching it erupt again. The viral clip isn't about new beef. It's about unhealed wounds. Brown still feels betrayed. Clark still feels responsible for calling it like it is. And the system that allowed this to snowball into a national flashpoint still hasn't done anything to stop it from happening again. What this feud reveals is not just tension between two men. It's a fault line in professional sports. One where generational values clash with evolving identities. Where respect for tradition gets weaponized against those who challenge it. Where media commentary can shift from analysis to personal attack in the blink of a broadcast. Brown's rise disrupted the balance, but he didn't break it alone. The Steelers organization allowed resentment to build. They failed to realign their culture as their roster changed. They let their leaders clash without ever stepping in. And when things fell apart, they stood back and watched the fallout play out in the press. Clark stepped into the role of critic with the credibility of experience. But that experience came with emotional weight. And when he used it to frame Brown as not just problematic, but morally defective, the conversation turned from critique to condemnation. The real tragedy? It didn't have to end like this. Had there been support systems in place, mediation, internal dialogue, a cultural reassessment, this could have been resolved before it ever reached the headlines. But the NFL isn't designed for nuance. It's designed for performance. And when performance falters, it turns people into headlines, not humans. Brown versus Clark is the case study in how legacy and accountability get twisted when institutions refuse to evolve. Both men carry scars from a system that rewards silence until silence fails. And once those private tensions spill into the public, no one's really in control. That's why the footage matters. Not for what was said, but for what's still unsaid. For the silence that surrounds a conflict, for the absence of any real attempt to address the root issues, cultural evolution, racial tension, media responsibility, and leadership failure. This isn't about assigning blame. It's about acknowledging what happens when powerful systems ask players to carry emotional labor they never signed up for. Brown shouldn't have had to choose between greatness and being understood. Clark shouldn't have had to become the enforcer of values without institutional backup. And yet, here we are, watching the unresolved repeat itself. If you've been following this story since the beginning, you know this is more than drama. It's a reflection of everything professional sports refuses to confront. If this resonated with you, like the video, drop a comment on how you think this could have been handled differently, and subscribe for more breakdowns of the moments that go deeper than the headlines. Because this isn't over, and the next eruption might already be on its way. You know what's wild? We're over a decade into this Antonio Brown, Ryan Clark saga, and the NFL still acts surprised every time it resurfaces, as if this was ever going to just fade quietly into the background, as if something this layered, this personal, this structural, could ever be reduced to two guys beefing. But here we are again, viral footage, national headlines, heated words exchanged, and once again, the league is scrambling. Not because they don't understand what's happening, but because deep down they know they helped create it. This isn't a glitch. This is a system working exactly as it was built. Reward performance, ignore interpersonal damage, and when things explode, call it distraction. Let's go back to that explosion point. Late 2018, the Steelers are imploding. Antonio Brown, still putting up elite numbers, is clashing with Ben Roethlisberger. Reports surfaced that he threw a ball at him during practice. A physical altercation. Tensions are at an all-time high, and instead of smoothing things over, the team benches Brown for the final game of the season. And just like that, it's open season. Ryan Clark, now at ESPN, sitting comfortably in the analyst chair, goes live and makes it crystal clear. The Steelers need to move on. He's a bad person, he says. A bad person. Not a bad teammate. Not a problematic player. A bad person. That language wasn't casual. It wasn't commentary. It was condemnation. And when it came from someone who shared the locker room with Brown, who knew the pressure, the politics, the personalities, it landed differently. It felt like betrayal. And Brown responded the way only Antonio Brown can. Publicly, furiously, and with no regard for fallout. Calling Clark an Uncle Tom on Instagram wasn't just a heat-of-the-moment insult. It was a calculated reframing. Brown flipped the narrative. This wasn't just about a teammate calling him out. It was about how and why that call-out happened. It was about who gets to say what in public, and who that speech ultimately serves. Because for Brown, Clark wasn't just offering to take. He was using his proximity to the team, and more importantly, his status as a respected black former player, to validate an establishment narrative that Brown had become toxic, that he was a problem. And to Brown, that wasn't just unfair, it was a violation. A public shaming delivered through the mouth of someone who should have known better. And here's where things get even heavier. When Brown pulled that racial lever, labeling Clark with one of the most charged accusations in the black community, he wasn't just going for shock. He was trying to regain control of the story. Because in his world, a world where the league, the press, and even some teammates viewed him as volatile, the only way to shift the power dynamic was to hit back harder. The fallout was instant. Suddenly, Clark had to defend not just his commentary, but his identity, his career, his place in media, and not just to white audiences, but within black spaces that now questioned whether he was performing for acceptance or standing for truth. Because that's what happens when race gets introduced. It doesn't stay surface level. It becomes about everything. Meanwhile, the NFL, nowhere to be found. No mediation. No behind-the-scenes outreach. No league-wide conversation on how to handle post-career media ethics or conflict resolution or emotional fallout between players who shared not just a locker room, but a legacy. And that silence, it's not just disappointing. It's strategic. Because if the NFL acknowledged the deeper implications of this feud, it would have to address how little it does to prepare players for what happens after the game ends. It would have to reckon with the fact that it treats athletes like assets while they're useful and case studies once they're not. Brown and Clark didn't just disagree. They represented two different eras, two different worldviews, and two different ideas of what loyalty means. Brown believed in earned autonomy. He wasn't about paying dues. He was the dues. His performance justified his presence. Clark believed in tradition, that you earn the right to speak, to lead, to challenge, through sacrifice, respect, and submission to the system. And without a framework to navigate that ideological split, what do you think was going to happen? This wasn't about who was right. It was about who the system was designed to protect. Clark became the mouthpiece of that system, not maliciously, not with bad intentions, but because that's the role media analysts often fall into, especially former players. You're expected to deliver insight, honesty, and critique, but always within the boundaries of what the league considers acceptable. And for black analysts, those boundaries are even tighter. Brown, on the other hand, became the symbol of what happens when a star decides he's no longer going to follow those unspoken rules. When he decides to speak his mind, act on emotion, and live in defiance of a machine that once celebrated him. So now, with this new footage out, it's not just two guys arguing. It's the physical manifestation of years of tension, media narratives, racial undertones, and a complete failure by the NFL to create space for reconciliation. And the most frustrating part? They both have a point. Brown was right to feel betrayed. He had every reason to expect that a former teammate would either reach out privately or, at the very least, offer critique with compassion. He believed Clark used inside knowledge not to uplift, but to condemn. Clark was also right. Brown's behavior was public. His conflicts were disruptive. His choices affected the team, the locker room, and the culture. And Clark, as an analyst, felt a responsibility to call it out, especially because he had lived through it firsthand. But here's the truth. It never should have escalated this far. The moment Brown threw that term out in public, it should have been met with intervention, not just from Clark's camp, but from the NFL itself. The fact that it wasn't tells you everything you need to know about how the league handles interpersonal crisis. They wait for it to go viral, then distance themselves from it like it wasn't baked into the system they built. Now ask yourself, how many more stories like this are sitting just beneath the surface? How many more unresolved tensions are bubbling, waiting for the next viral moment? How many more athletes will be cast as either ungrateful or out of control, simply for refusing to follow a structure that was never built for them in the first place? This isn't just about Antonio Brown and Ryan Clark. It's about every player who's ever felt abandoned by their team once the headlines turned. Every analyst who's ever been pressured to deliver hot takes about people they once called brothers. Every black athlete who's had to choose between telling the truth and protecting the illusion of unity. Brown didn't break the system. He revealed it. Clark didn't create the divide. He inherited it. And the league? It's still pretending it has nothing to do with it. So where does that leave us? Right here. Still watching the fallout in real time. Still dissecting every word, every gesture, every frame of the footage. Because deep down, we all know this is bigger than a feud. It's a case study in what happens when brilliance meets tradition, when honesty meets loyalty, and when the institutions tasked with protecting players decide it's easier to sit back and let them fight it out. But you've heard enough from us. What do you think? Did Clark cross a line? Did Brown go too far? Or was this always inevitable in a league that refuses to evolve? There's something deeply unsettling about watching this Antonio Brown and Ryan Clark conflict unfold, again, right in front of everyone, like a looping highlight reel that refuses to fade. Every time you think it's over, that maybe enough time has passed or enough distance has been created, another piece of footage surfaces, and we're dragged right back into it. Because the truth is, nothing ever really got resolved. The core tension between individual brilliance and collective expectations, between legacy and loyalty, was never addressed. It just went quiet, for a while, until it didn't. This latest video isn't shocking because of what was said. It's shocking because of how familiar it feels. The body language, the emotion, the decades of resentment bubbling to the surface in a matter of seconds. This isn't about a disagreement. It's about what happens when years of silence calcify into something that looks and feels like permanent rupture. But it's important to remember why it's still erupting, why the air between them still feels thick with unfinished business. Because what happened between Brown and Clark wasn't just a spat between two former teammates. It was a public, symbolic battle over everything the NFL has never been equipped to handle. Cultural evolution, racial dynamics, power shifts, and the invisible politics of who gets to speak and who doesn't. Clark's criticism of Brown back in 2019 wasn't received like any old hot take. It hit harder. It carried more weight because it came from someone who'd been there, who had shared that space. Someone who, in Brown's eyes, should have known better than to air dirty laundry on national television, especially given the power imbalance between media analysts and active players. Especially given how rare it is for black players to control their own narrative in white-dominated media ecosystems. Clark wasn't a stranger. He was a former brother-in-arms. And when he said Brown was a bad person, it didn't sound like analysis. It sounded like judgment, like moral indictment, broadcasted to millions. That was the trigger. That's what made it personal. And that's when Brown retaliated in the most provocative way he could, by throwing out the Uncle Tom label. A term heavy with history, heavy with pain. It's not just an insult. It's a charge, an accusation that someone has betrayed their own, not for truth, but for approval. And in one Instagram post, Brown shifted the narrative. Now, the story wasn't about his behavior. It was about who had the right to speak on it. And at what cost? And maybe that's why this whole saga still cuts so deep, because both men were caught in roles they didn't fully choose but couldn't escape. Brown was always going to be seen as the rebel, the rule breaker, the problem. Clark, intentionally or not, ended up in a role of enforcer, upholding the very structures that Brown was trying to dismantle. And the league? The league stayed quiet. Let's be honest, none of this had to happen the way it did. The NFL had multiple opportunities to intervene, to mediate, to set standards for how former players working in media speak about current ones, to provide safe, internal mechanisms for conflict resolution. But instead, it stood back and watched the tension play out like entertainment. And it's not just the league that failed here. It's the broader culture around sports, the one that treats athletes like characters in a drama series, where conflict equals engagement and resolution is a boring afterthought. Brown and Clark became symbols, avatars for larger conversations, stripped of their humanity, the complexity of their positions, flattened into sound bites. But the thing is, this story was never black and white. Brown had every right to feel violated. He felt like Clark weaponized personal experience to discredit him on a national stage. That kind of exposure, coming from someone you once shared a field with, hurts in ways strangers' opinions never could. Clark, though, wasn't just taking shots. He saw his role as a truth-teller, as someone with a responsibility to call out behavior that undermined the team values he still held sacred. In his mind, what Brown did during his final seasons in Pittsburgh did affect the culture, and he felt he owed it to that culture, to the institution that raised them both, to say so. Neither man is fully right or fully wrong. That's what makes this story stick. And maybe that's a real problem. The NFL doesn't leave room for nuance. You're either a hero or a villain, a company man or a disruptor. There's no in-between, no space to say, both of these men are speaking truth, and yet they're in conflict because the system never gave them the tools to speak to each other. This isn't about who yelled louder. It's about who never got heard. And now we're seeing the result. Two grown men, still visibly burdened by everything left unsaid, everything left unresolved, and a system, an industry, that continues to benefit from the drama, while doing nothing to repair the damage it helped cause. If you're watching this unfold and thinking, why now? Ask yourself, when was it ever actually over? Did either of them apologize? Was there any real accountability? Or did everyone just move on because the cameras turned away? Well, the cameras are back. And this time, maybe we don't just react. Maybe we listen to the pain, to the pride, to the principles both of them still believe in. And maybe, just maybe, we start to question why the NFL, with all its resources and all its reach, still has no roadmap for navigating the human cost of cultural transition. The story between Antonio Brown and Ryan Clark didn't start with that contract. It didn't end with that Instagram post. And this video, it's not the conclusion. It's the proof that when you bury tension instead of resolving it, it doesn't go away. It multiplies. If this story hit a nerve, speak on it. Drop your thoughts in the comments. What do you think this feud really says about the NFL? About how we treat players, especially once they step off the field? Hit like if you think it's time for the league to face what it's ignored. Share this if you're tired of seeing unresolved pain repackaged as content. And subscribe, because we're going to keep peeling back the layers the league hopes we'll forget. This conversation isn't done. Not even close.